All right. My name is Peter Underhill. I'm a composer and pianist, originally from Spokane, Washington, and I'm a first-year DMA, a Doctor of Musical Arts in Composition student here at UGA.
Hello everyone, I'm Kulula Kuzungu. I'm a third-year doctoral student. I'm on my way out. And I'm a composer-performer. Both practices inform each other.
My name is William Emdy. I'm a third-year undergrad music composition major. I'm a composer and a trombonist. You asked us about like what we're focusing on too. Should we answer that question too?
Yeah, if you
Yeah, I've been focusing on adding electronics with the trombone to solo. Has anyone listened to Andy Clausen by chance? Probably not. He plays trombone and does electronics in the same vein. Yeah.
I'm Jake Shanley. I am a second year Doctor of Music composition student. And I like focusing on large ensemble work, so I write a lot for orchestra, for wind ensemble, things like that. It's my jam.
Hello, I'm Mia Hill. I'm a second year master's student in music composition. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and right now I'm focusing on sort of electronics, but also trying to merge my work with Latin music because I have a lot of roots in that.
Hi, I'm Mateo Wojcik, second year DMA student. I'm from Long Island, New York, and I'm starting to get into spatialization, kind of like along the lines of what Dr. Lane's been working on, and I am taking lessons with him this year, and just combining like that electronic realm with acoustic performance.
My name is Richie Arndorfer. I'm a first year DMA student here from the Midwest, and I'm also an oboist. And my music tends to go in wild directions, but I like to incorporate technology with a lot of it, and even sometimes like text and theater, that kind of thing.
I should have asked Peter this, but I was thinking of some of your work when I read about it in Uganda and the biodiversity, the sounds from the stones and stuff that just suddenly remind me of that. But so many people here focus on similar things in terms of biodiversity, cultural diversity, and so on. I suppose my pressing question as a naive person who's never composed anything was what drew you to composition? It's a sort of, it's not what kids are taught to do. Lots of kids are pushed into practicing an instrument, learning an instrument, but it's not people aren't really pushed to compose when they're young, right? So it's kind of a unique kind of drive, I think, and I just wanted to know what each of you or some of you wanted to share about what drove you to compose. When did you see that as your goal or the thing that basically drew spark?
Sorry. So I always found that when I was young, I started playing music when I was like 7 or 8 years old, and I didn't start taking lessons, like formal classical lessons, right away. And I always found that just like tinkering around on my instrument, I just couldn't play the things that I wanted to. So I ended up just writing small things for myself to play. And so that's kind of how I started writing, was writing things that were within my skill level that like I just, I didn't know anything about what I was writing. I was just kind of doing it intuitively. And then that blossomed out to the point where it was most of my kind of musical life was just putting things together for myself to play. And I was like, wait, I can do that for other people too. And then, and Dr. Lane was talking about the idea of like people performing your music is super, super cool. And just, hearing your first, large ensemble piece or your first, big chamber recital or something like that, it's a big deal. And it's like it's something to be proud of when it's done. So I think that feeling and the combination with that and me just kind of writing for myself is how it started.
A different approach was my teacher was like, you should consider going into composition. I come from South Africa, I'm proud to say that, and we value academia very much. And so studying music was like, you study music, like what are you going to do with that? And so when I could tell my parents, no, I'll be studying like this specific scale, they were listening more intensely. But it became a very, like Dr. Lane was saying, narcissistic thing, I guess. This idea that I can create something that I created and listen back to it. Because I deal with electronic instruments, so I really value the immediacy of electronic instruments and being able to listen back to something right there and then. And so yeah, I listened to my teacher who said consider doing composition. I was a pianist at the time, I guess I still am. A pianist. It's touch and go. And yeah, when I went into the university back home, they have different streams that you can focus on, and one of them is composition. And yeah, I did it, and then I did a study abroad to America, and I was like, I like the way the Americans think about this. So I decided to study further here, but it is definitely it's for myself practice that hopefully someone else gets to appreciate too. But I'm okay if it's just me, myself, and I in the room.
I know for me, it was the very, very, very cliche route where my mom and I always watched movies together and we loved it and that was our thing. And then I started paying attention more to the score. I feel like almost maybe half of us were all like, I want to score films because that's where a lot of people start. And, that still rings true for me, but ever since I've gotten to UGA, since I did my undergrad here as well, that, my desire to score films has stayed there, but I have become so much more interested in other fields of music and just sound in general. But the initial desire was film scoring.
For me, I spent most of my childhood, I'll say, as a cellist, and in high school, I was in a trio and a quartet with some of my closest friends, and I used to basically be the arranger for us. And I did that because our group was 2 cellos, a violin and viola, rather than 2 violins and 1 viola, 1 cello. And then because they were my best friends, one day I was like, I want to write a piece for them. And so basically each person got their own movement. And there was just something that felt really special about that, and I ended up using it on my college audition portfolios also. And so that meant a lot to me, and it felt like the most right thing for me to do in terms of music, because I was new, I wanted to do music, but before I got into composing, I was like, oh, I could be an orchestra teacher or I could be a solo cellist. And I knew I did not have the chops to be a solo cellist whatsoever. And I was like, okay, I could be an orchestra teacher, but it didn't click with me as much as just putting not just the notes together, but also working with other people. And I'm still really drawn to that. And then in recent years, I'm trying to get back into that, writing for specific people. It just feels more meaningful to me than writing a piece and just finding whoever to play it.
I think maybe bounce off of what Mateo was just saying and extend your question a little bit, and maybe just ask everyone if there is a specific piece or a moment or a story. I know with me, I can remember I only had a vague idea of what composition even was, and then I was just given a prompt to do this thing for people, and then that kind of story just congealed into this powerful moment for me. And I'm wondering if you all have maybe a specific piece or moment.
I can share a little bit about some of that. I tell people I got into composing because I was really bored, and I have 2 older sisters who are both 5 years older than me, and so in middle school there was just not a lot to do after I was done with classes and got home. So it was either practicing piano or writing music. I think one of the early experiences was, actually 2 experiences. I had a wonderful high school music teacher who encouraged composition as part of our coursework. And so I was paired with a good friend of mine who played alto sax and wrote a piece that we premiered together. And that was kind of the first big moment of, wow, that what Mateo and Richie were talking about, of making music for a friend, playing it with a friend, that experience. And then also I was really impacted early on. There's a wonderful composer in Seattle, Janice Gitek, who has taught at Cornish for a number of years. And actually I was thinking of her as you were presenting, because she really instilled in me this idea of all the rhythms of the body as you move and go about your day. And so I think that was another formative experience that really kind of blew open my categories of, you know, music isn't just that thing I do at the piano playing like Mozart. It is this really broad, embodied, really open experience.
My experience is, well, my dad was a music theorist. He has like he got his master's in music theory. So he would listen to a ton of like art songs, and I hated it when I was like, I hated it. He could speak fluent German, and he would sing along to them, but I'd be like, Dad, please stop. It's 9 p.m. and I don't want to hear this. And a little bit of the composition, the inspiration for composing was like not wanting to hear any more art songs. I was tired of them. But then something that expanded my boundaries really, really early was he took me to see Emery. It wasn't a piano quartet like the definition of piano quartet. It was 4 pianos. I think a piano quartet means it has like strings. I don't know why it is how that is, but there was 4 pianos playing the Rite of Spring, and they played all of it all the way through. And I was not much older. I think it was like 12 or so. And they had people come out in leotards that were like skin tone. They looked very much like naked, and would do these crazy dances. But it blew up in my like conceptions of what music was. I heard a bunch of art songs. I heard of popular music, but like seeing just like the power that could come from large ensembles doing something together in a well executed manner really inspired me to try doing this. That was the big moment.
Yeah. Now I'm going to ask you, it's a long time since you made the decision to be a composer.
It chose me. My mother told me that as a small boy I would sing songs that she'd never heard. They obviously didn't have words, they just had tunes. And of course I was making them up. And so then I think another thing was I just felt music and so much. I was a very emotional boy, and it seemed the only way that I could possibly communicate that was music. And then finally the definition came out. I turned out, at a time I was living a parallel life as a young lad. I was a rock and roll musician and I was a classical musician. In those days, you weren't allowed to tell them. And look, pop music industry was worse. Classical music was more tolerant, my rock musician, than the rock music world was. So I had to keep it a big secret. But then again, I had to make a choice, and it was emotion. It was actually, I love the exhilaration of rock and roll. I love the energy. I love the power to move and the power to dance, but actually there are some other things I want to say, and I feel I have to say, and so that was what then I ran away from rock and roll and became an avant-garde musician.
I feel like that's something we can all probably relate to, though, is that like classical like pop rock divide, which there's definitely, it's less of an opposition these days, thankfully, but
changed a lot. Yes, it really has.
It's still out there in the world. I'm wondering how you all maybe relate to that.
Yeah, so part of my dissertation is having to navigate that. I am a big fan of songs, not art songs, but songs as we don't understand them on the radio. And I have never interacted with songs, commercial songs, in an academic space. And so don't really know how to talk about them, in academic language. And I'm learning how to do that. But yeah, there's an appreciation for the song because my culture is a vocal culture. Also, Zulu people really love singing. And so songs are really important to me. And being in a space right now where I can do that really means a lot to me. But then, yeah, there's no language really. I'm still finding it. But I really appreciate, to go back to the previous song, what made me want to become a composer. It's kind of what Nigel was saying, it chose me. I was explaining this to a friend the other day. I was like, I can't fall asleep. If I need to create something, I will not go to sleep. And maybe I'm crazy, but that's what will happen. And I kind of like that. I'm like, okay, there's something that wants to come out that needs to be put down somewhere. And for me, it's just recording and capturing it. with electronic tools. And I love that process. And so I'm like all over the place now. But I do that with my research in using songs, but then also using my language cluster, which has clicks, and incorporating those clicks in my writing away from what people might be familiar with, which is just language, right? So I'm sure you guys have heard the Click song, very famous by Miriam Makeba. So people are very familiar and used to hearing the click that way, myself included. But what does it look like to put those clicks through electronic tools and manipulate them and change them in different ways to get material to write songs with in a different approach? So yeah, I really value what you were saying about having this like classical and rock situation. The same thing with me with like classical music, whatever that means, with song, commercial writing, songs. How can we appreciate them on an equal plane in the academic space?
That's something that's got much better.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, when I was teaching in Edinburgh, we had various solutions. I was lucky enough to persuade one of Uganda's master drummers, Albert Sempeki, to join my faculty. So all my students learned Ugandan drumming. They didn't have to, but nobody refused. And then, how do we get rock and roll? How do we get kind of, chord sequences of popular music? Well, I started a community course. You don't get people to sit down academically and work out the chords to Bob Dylan's song, sorry. You feel your way on the guitar, you just know it. And however, in the community context where you're sitting with kids learning these songs, then you do have to find the chords and help them find the chords. And so that becomes a way of doing it that doesn't pseudo-academicize it, because it will suffer from that. This is, rock and roll is rock and roll, I'll say. And has to have its crazy space to live in. And so the community thing allowed us to do that. And then in cultures that needed discipline, like, Ugandan drumming, then we bring the experts in. And we very, very conscientiously learn. And if we learn and work for about 7 years, we can become quite good and accepted in the culture.
I think for me, my moment as a composer was strangely enough found as a performer, which I know is kind of backwards, but it'll make sense, I promise. And it's twofold. One of them was actually your piece, Bruleko, Echoes of a Dying Breed, which did focus on the Xhosa language and the clicks. And I was very nervous to perform it, but you had me learn the language, or at least learn the clicking and the phonetics of it. And that really changed my mindset of what composition could be. It really just sort of broke that perception. And the other one was just my band, which is another rock and roll thing. Like it's slowly merging together, but I'm in a band with 4 other composers. And the time that I spend with them is it's something beautiful that you can just create together. And I guess being a performer and being a composer shares a lot of aspects, and oftentimes you're kind of doing both at the same time. But that was it for me. And I realized over the years in my time here that community is so, so important to the music I make. And I think that's just because I'm a social person, but I think we can all agree that the people you're with are very important to your education as well as your professors. You learn from your peers as well. At least you.
Talking about I see all of you talking about your process really in some way or the other, whether it involves other people or... does anyone else want to chime in some? Oh yeah, go ahead.
I had another question with, specifically we talk a lot about how bad it is for our mental health and well-being to compose music. And this conference seems to be sort of centered around the opposite. So I know there's plenty of examples like shutting yourself away for hours and hours and, sort of exploring your own influences and biases and things like that. But do any of you have any positive aspects of composition for your mental health? Do you think about that positively?
Yeah, the reason why I'm saying is because I'm a composer, truthfully. Like, I am so grateful that I can be a musician, performer, composer. It really, centers me. That's a personal experience. And yeah, whenever I feel like the brain is doing a little bit of this, when I go and write, when I go and create, it brings everything back to just center, you know. But I also think adding to that is I'm constantly listening to music. Like, if you're walking past me, I always have headphones in. And it's not because I'm trying to block the world out. I'm just constantly always appreciating someone else's creation and what they did. And whether I've listened to that song 10 times and thereby know it better, or I'm listening to the first time, I'm just constantly always in that space. And funny enough, like Dr. Lane was saying, like sometimes it's okay to like, it's better to like not do that. For me, it's the opposite. When I'm pressing stop on something, I'm like, okay, I kind of have to be now in the real world in some way. So maybe it's an escapism thing, maybe. But there's just something so beautiful about like immersing yourself in whatever world someone created, sonically or through lyrics or whatever, constantly, that just feeds me in a way that has been like a mental health practice of mine, a conscious one, in the recent years. Yeah.
I think also there's a special, the composer's journey. It's weird, I don't even like the word composer, maybe creative musician's journey, is a rather unique one. And literacy brought that in as well, because of notes and things. But actually, those long, prolonged periods that can be so damaging can also be learning. And even in the depression that comes, in the inevitable yin and yang of creativity, the bright lights and the darkness, you're learning. And so, for example, in my work in music medicine, music therapy, I wouldn't have stood a chance of making that successful if I'd not been there, deep down, deep in those difficult places that we work with sound and feeling. So I wouldn't have a chance. Also, it taught me resilience. My God, I can work like nobody else. The composer that has to work all night and not sleep for a week learns a resilience that nobody else has, believe me. And I get through work like nobody else can get through. So I think there are benefits, and there's also a lot of people have talked about selfishness and narcissism. I believe that, don't misplace that, I believe that people are entitled to a time of looking for themselves, particularly at the age that you guys are. You have to. You've got to be looking. It's your time. You're owed this. Later, you can turn it to gold. Later, you can find out how you're going to really give something great to other people from it. But you need time to build it before you can give it. So there's that. So I wouldn't worry too much about this selfish narcissist thing. No. The very fact that people are so aware of it means it's not a danger. But there's time to grow. And it gets easier. The things come together. The hard march of a composer becomes, okay, I'm going to do this now. I'm going to get there. It becomes easier. Time goes on.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, this is just more of an aside. I was speaking there was a guest speaker at some business class that I was in, and I was asking him about how he found himself as a young comedian. He was a comedian. And how he dealt with imposter syndrome and his creative process and dealing with when the thing you want to make doesn't work or the things that you want to put together don't fit right. And when you, like, how you deal with not having all the answers. And he told me, well, there's nothing wrong with not having all of the answers. You as a young person need to fight for your time in the wilderness of not knowing what's coming next or what's happening really. And that sort of stuck with me, and that made me feel not complacent, but comfortable with being a young musician.
Thinking about what you said, Mia, and just kind of this topic in general of mental health and how do we think about some of the positive aspects of all of this. I think there's a theme, at least among many of us, of like doing composition, maybe at times because we feel a little awkward as performers. At least for me, that was a big deal of like, I know I'm never going to make it as a concert pianist, but this is something that I can have and can hold on to. And so as you have this question, Grayson, I was thinking about the most recent piece that I've worked on, which kind of had like two purposes. I knew that I was soon to be moving here to Athens and was leaving a really, really rich community in Columbia, South Carolina, folks that I had gotten to know over 6 years, and we spent time together 3, 4, 5 times a week. And so there was one part of wanting to write this piece called Album Amicorum, a book of friendship, where I wanted to have kind of a going away party, or like replanting party, where I would write pieces for these folks and play it for them, and we would, share it and have kind of a ritual almost to mark something that was really beautiful and meaningful. But also it was kind of like the first piano piece that I had written in many, many years, and it was important for me to have a piece that felt like it kind of belonged to me and felt good to play. And so I as part of thinking about what it means to be a creative musician, I think oftentimes there's a good amount of like reclamation that goes on. After having made it through all of this training and education and learning the technique and really being focused on achieving a certain level of standard, I think there's something really beautiful then about like, oh wow, I can really be free now to just explore what is it that my hands enjoy playing at the piano, and what is it that I really feel is natural.
Yeah, your question?
Yeah, actually kind of going off of that, I'm curious then, how do you all kind of balance that more intellectual skill-based technique side of it with that more emotional component? Right? We talked about that body experience with music and stuff like that, or as you were talking about with your hands. How do you balance those two things when you have so much knowledge about music?
Oh yeah. Well, I like to have creative time where it's like I go into that session expecting that I'm just going to create ideas and trying my best to like not let anything influence me. And then I have like disciplined times where like I practice trombone and I take lessons, and a lot of that is just like figuring out how to make it work. So like you have the time to create these ideas, and then you use that disciplined time to figure out how to make it work. And usually they sort of, I don't like them to bleed into each other, but they definitely just bleed into each other like all the time. Because usually you like try to make these ideas happen, and you have to go back to the drawing board and the creative sessions. And so it is a balance, but it's also just like a mental switch of like being creative, then just like not turning off the creativity, but just being like, now I have to work. Like it's work. You just have to make the work happen.
Kind of going back to what that lady said, and I don't know her name, but like I know for myself right now, I'm trying my best to just work on feeling, like trusting that okay, it's been years now. There's something in my brain that has been trained toward whatever. But how does it feel? And it's kind of working. Like if it doesn't feel good, I don't explain it. It doesn't feel good, move on. If it feels good, great. Okay, there's something that's good about this. Let me carry on. And then also being okay with like, okay, I created this. Cool. Close it on the shelf. Next. And being okay with that, like just being okay with the fact that everything's gonna be a masterpiece. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece, and how you assess what a masterpiece is a whole different discussion. But yeah, just going back to the body of like, there is intuition, I guess, in like in the process, and okay, this, and then also playing for other people. Ho-ho! That's when you really get to know your intuition. Like, okay, well, this felt good to me. Do you feel the same way? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay. I'm the one that's crazy, and that's okay. But yeah, building that into the process, because like many people have acknowledged, like it can be like an isolated, process of okay, I'm locking myself in my room, and it's me, myself, and I. And being okay with like, Peter, pressing play. Can you listen to this? And give me your honest feedback. Not on like an assessment of like how can you write this better, of like, but how did you enjoy it? What if you didn't, why didn't you enjoy it? And that can really help with like knowing when that feels good too, but also trusting yourself, I think, is the main part in that.
Also intellectual and emotional things are mind and body, back to Rupert. Joining the mind and the body is one of the things composers do, and dancers and other. But we in particular have to take care of that relationship, and I think that's how it's done, mind and body.
Yeah. And sometimes I find that means composing might be at the piano, might be at my desk. Sometimes composing is 20 minutes of like grabbing hot chocolate and looking at artwork or taking a walk. Because there are those moments where like things just can't get done unless I first like made sure my body is well.
I like find there's like a lot of paradoxes that happen when you're composing, because it's like, yes, you need this like space to like be nourished, to like be able to sit down and work, but then you also just like need that regimented time to like, all right, I know that I can just waffle around all day and nothing will happen, but I just need to like sit down in my space and be diligent. But then you need that like meter going where it's like, okay, we've passed unhealthy territory. Find that balance. And I also really like that question about like technique and emotion and how those intertwine, because I feel like at one hand we like want to make emotion, right? Like, and our technique makes us better at that in some ways. Where like I'm trying to convey something, and because I've trained as a composer, I feel like I can do this better now. I'm getting better at doing this. So then there's like the paradox again, where sometimes you can get in your own way and maybe overthink it, and then sometimes you maybe have to, I don't know, improvise or just like catch yourself getting into this rut, and maybe you have to like figure out a new direction. I'm wondering, have any of you like, can you think of any specific moments lately you've run into that? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've been listening to a lot of Steve Reich, and I've been trying to emulate that like 80s minimalist sound for an orchestral piece I'm working on. But it was less intuitive than I thought it would be, and so I would go into my composition lessons and be like, I don't get it. Why does I know how I want it to sound, but I can't seem to like get it where I need it to be. And that, going back to the mental health thing, I end up tying a lot of self-worth to what I create, which I think is common amongst all of us. Mm-hmm. And I think like we just tie a lot of self-worth to like our output into the world, which I don't think is entirely healthy. But I also don't have another way of viewing it yet. I'm in the same boat. So all I have there is to propose a problem with the way we think about it. And I'll ponder a solution later, or maybe never.
More dramatic people. Contradicting.
What got me through that rut was a lot of intuition, and like allowing myself to like step back for a moment and just not like devoid of all emotion, but step back, let that emotion go for just a second and be like, what isn't shaping this right? And then not letting that affect how I feel, or being like, oh, this is terrible, scrap all of it. It was just a couple little things that made it how I wanted it to sound.
I'll add that composition really is like a perceptive thing. I find that, like you were saying, just like the smallest thing can completely change my perception of what I'm doing. I can feel like, oh, this is terrible, what I'm doing is not working, and I show it to a colleague or a friend or a professor, and they're just like, no, this is great. And I'm like, I don't get it. And then finally one thing clicks and I change something, and I'm like, oh, I get what I was trying to say. And it's just the smallest things can completely like change your perception and make us like feel what we were trying to feel in the first place, I think.
Yeah. Also, I think that this sort of thing is crucial. Like in therapeutic processes with children, the self-worth that comes from musical creativity is the biggest gift we can give to children. What's different for you is then there's a growing up process in the artistic path. And that's learning how to deal with the knocks, because it's not just to be yourself beating yourself up. The world is going to come and beat you up. And you need to get the resilience for that. And so in the process you're going through, you're learning that. Okay, I pick myself up again. And I keep going. And I protect my self-worth. because it's important to keep going, and we learn that. So that's the process. The student composition goes. It's very hard. It gets easier later because you learn that resilience. You get so tough. You get the right kind of crocodile skin. You don't care, and that comes as well as an autonomy. Then eventually comes autonomy. I don't care. I'm going to do this. But it's a path. It's a tough path, actually. That one, the learning to protect self-worth path. Very, very hard. But you get there, and you'll be really strong when you get there. That's the important thing.
Yes. I'd like to know your view about creation, whether art or music, as rigorous and in graduate school, as a rigorous philosophical and academic inquiry. Has it changed? Has it changed anything about your view of creativity as a form of self-cultivation? If it changed, or if it did not, I don't know.
In a way, yes. I find myself grappling with that now, where I'm like, is this really creative? Because I'm getting into that comparison thing of like, well, it's not that, and it's not that, and it's not these like amazing works that I might think are amazing. And so, yeah, I feel like I'm like, but that's not creativity. Creativity is just playing around with something new, right? And using all of the experiences and knowledge that we get from life because of that. So it's like trying to get back to that space of like a child being given a paper and a pen and go ahead and create. They're not thinking, well, actually, you know. And so trying to get back to that space, but like, we acknowledge here that like from a more mature point of view, it's really challenging. And yeah, I think it's probably going to be a lifelong journey. So I don't know, but yeah, it's definitely something that I'm struggling with currently.
Going off of that, I'll say that, you know, I was talking about when I was really young and I was like just writing music for myself to play, I kind of had no inhibitions about like what I was going to do. I could just make anything I wanted, and I didn't care what other people thought. It was just about me just kind of spitting something out. And then as I kind of grew and learned more about music, I'm a pretty like cerebral person in general, and so it got very like I got bogged down in my own like thinking about things too much and like music theory and this and this and this, and I was just like, I've gotten to the point where I'm trying to grapple with the question of like, what do I have to say though? What does all that matter? Like, I think it still does, and I think I've tried to balance the concept of thinking from an intellectual perspective about what I'm doing, and also saying something with that. And how do I say something in a way that like I think is logical, but it's been kind of getting back to the way that I thought when I was a kid, which was just like nothing was off limits from the perspective of creativity.
You want to say something? Go.
Like adding on to that, I feel like I will confess, the more I go to grad school, the more composing feels like work, like an obligation, especially because you have like the weekly lessons that you have to show up to, and like you need material to talk about with your teacher. And so I've been doing that since I was a freshman. So it's been like 6 or 7 years now, and you get really trapped in that cycle. And I think I'm starting to I'm trying to detach myself from that, because like even though it is work, I'm trying to not view that as like a negative thing. Like it's still something I feel personally obligated to, even though it is an obligation in like an academic sense. Yeah. I think for me it goes back to what I was saying earlier, like it's having like other people, that's what keeps me feeling creative, and not just like I'm like trying to solve a puzzle here and figure out where the pieces go when I'm like writing the notes on the page. So I'm in the middle of that struggle, I think. Yeah.
It's worth saying in the universities, this has been around for a long time. The Doctor of Music is one of the oldest doctorates from the 14th century, long before PhDs and any of these newfangled things were dreamt about. We had doctorates in music. Why? Because people felt there was some kind of corpus of knowledge that was worth transmitting and that people could be accountable for. You could decide whether somebody achieved or not within this. So it became possible. The problem your generation has, and mine now, is that many of the linguistic certainties of the past have gone. Even when I began teaching composition, I had a simple task, I felt a duty, that I had to introduce to my students the basic materials of Western modernism, and other modernisms where they existed, of India, for example, which nobody teaches, but we did, to offer these things. However, now, my last years as a composition teacher, I no longer taught a mainstream. I took everybody's work and dealt with it relatively. Where's the truth in this? Where is the consistency in this? What is this about? And how can it be itself? Became the question. So it's become much more complicated. But we need those things in order to decide how much it can be itself. It's not so bad to have harmonized a few Bach chorales, because that's an example or Palestrina counterpoint of how perfect something can be in realizing itself. So it's not that we want to copy those models. They are examples to us of how complete things can be. So that's another value of this context, is knowing how complete and truthful something can be. And try and aim towards that in our work. But that became my work as a composition teacher, was diagnostic. I would analyze the work of my note by note of my students. What is this? What does this mean? Not abstractly. And what does this feel? What color is this? Where is this emotionally? That's what we would do. So it's a very difficult time for composers. But you've never been needed more. I don't know in my life a point where composers and what they can do have been needed more and valued less. And in fact, you're lucky in this environment, you have more opportunities. The United States academic environment, thank God, it's a place you can still do things. But worldwide, it's gone. But don't worry, because you will be the generation that creates the other directions. You're going to have to, because everything's been new for you guys. But you're desperately needed. The perceptions that a composer has in depth of contact with reality, material, and consciousness are things that are lacking in our human experience. You have to cultivate and share those things. So please, it's the most important time for a composer now. The most important time I've ever known. So I warmly encourage you to take heart. And come to us old guys who get stuck. Because, we're desperate to help because we know how important it is.
I think, if I may real quick, that last point is so pertinent in like the last 3, 4, 5 years in thinking about large language models and thinking about some of the ethics and controversy of what happens when large technological corporations begin just sucking up the creative works of thousands of human beings. And I think one of the things that I've been really heartened by is just the knowledge that, like, when I'm writing music about the sensation of stargazing in central Washington at midnight, that is something that is so embodied and so sensate and tactile, and that there's something really unique and special there. And so I think I think the current environment has driven me more and more to think about the humanness of what it is that we do.
Yeah, they can steal your work, but they can't steal your soul.
Yeah.
Period.
Well, I was going to also speak on what Nigel said as far as university being a safe space for creation and for specifically non-commercially viable creation, which is sort of what it used to be with how we think of looking down on pop and rock music as, oh, this is just simple stuff that doesn't belong in a university setting, when in reality, everybody who has a degree in this sort of thing, we know that it's actually really cool music that they make in pop and rock music. And part of that separation is just like, we make academic music that isn't commercially viable, and the university has a obligation to protect that music and still uphold it. Rock and pop music can be commercially viable, And so there's sort of support for that outside of academia. And that was somewhat of the separation that sort of grew into university. And of course, now you could argue rock music is not commercially viable anymore. And there's a lot of, tension between that. So it sort of starts to bleed together. And I, in my composition lessons, have brought my rock songs into the lesson and asked, what could I do to make this more interesting? What could I do to make this better? And I know some of you have had similar experiences with that, right? I mean, it's blending together, but at the same time, protecting musical ideas that don't make money.
Absolutely, and also there's been a migration into, my last years of teaching, there was a migration into my postgraduate department of rock musicians, electrical DJs, people looking for a place to do precisely that, to create stuff that wasn't just for a market. That's been encouraging. It made for a very exciting environment in my time in Edinburgh to have that variety of creative artists together in music. Beautiful things happen. So that's a very encouraging. I'm sorry for rock and roll. It found itself in the desert again. But come and there was a place, and that's due to the university. The universities, though, have got to remain creative. And don't let the bureaucrats sap away the creative juice from your creative departments. The universities have got to understand creative. They don't, on the whole. And we've really got to insist on protecting that. So you fight for that. Don't let them mess with creative juices.
I have a question to all of you then exactly that light, because it goes to the heart of training and music education. So when I talk about creativity is what I study. And I think a lot of the problems that when people think about their own creativity is that they confuse two lenses, which is your internal lens, so you're creating something that feels exciting, creative to you, and then you're having to put something out there that someone else, whether it's your teacher who sees your compositions every week, or someone else is judging. And so that's an external frame. And you start at some level, there's going to start by being a dissonance there, where you find something creative and it doesn't, and then the whole thing is this sensibility training. And I'm just wondering, when you are being trained as a composer, is the focus on this external perspective, well, this sounds like that, or is there enough sort of what you were saying, which is, what are you trying to resonate? What are you feeling? Why did you make? So are you being directed? And I think that's what the LLM, we have to do this in the age of AI and LLMs to give people more confidence, and they have to know what's out there. You're the stewards of the field of music, so you must know everything that's there and what's gone and understand it all and be able to speak it fluently. You need to speak your language fluently. But I'm wondering whether the training focuses enough on the sensibility of the internal perspective enough. And I wonder where a lot of the conflict that an aspiring artist feels is that schism. Why it works so well in the context of music therapy is that you don't care about the external perspective as much, as long as the child, the patient, is responding. It works. It resonates. It works, right? And so I was just wondering whether you could speak to the training. It's like, do you feel? What are music composition programs like? Maybe you can't talk about here, or elsewhere. But I was just wondering whether there is this focus as much on you, Richie. Each of you, Mateo. What is it? Because each of you brings something unique to it. And all of you have different stories about what drew you to your music and to composition. Sorry, am I breaking?
That's a good question. I'll say that I think that we're very fortunate here to have 3 great composition faculty who do, at the heart of it, want to get what we're trying to say out into the world. I can say for a fact from experience that is not the case everywhere. I know that here, all 3 composition faculty, they're like, what are you trying to say? What are you trying to do with this? And every time that you bring any of them a piece, they're like, okay, they're not looking at it through they are looking at it through their own lens, but they're trying to say, okay, what are you trying to say here? Not, how does this relate to this, this, and this, or trying to make you into something that you're not. Whereas I've definitely attended schools and heard of schools where faculty are very much just kind of trying to push you into a mold of some archetypal composer that probably never existed and will never exist. And I think that's really unfortunate. And I'm very glad that here at UGA we have such great faculty that don't think like that.
Adding on to what Jake said, I feel like it's also a matter of framing, and I feel like the way I've seen my lessons over the years here and at some of the other schools I've been to is that, like, the things you hear from your teacher, it's to hone that internal lens, and that should, I hope, give you more confidence in your own decision so that when you're not in school and you don't have someone to respond to every week, you can trust that what you're doing, like, feels right to your work.
Just to plug the SEA, we also provide a space, or try to do our best to provide a space where the creations that are being created can be shared, and we do our best to not put you gotta bring this type of piece, or you gotta we try and support as much as possible the creator and what they envisioned, but more importantly that they can share their work. We have 4 every semester, and so please support. But yes, that's a really good space. I feel like that all of us get to use and have, and we have a wonderful space, the Dance Center for New Music, that is set up in a way that can handle a lot of different configurations for performance, and so we really are fortunate, as Jake was saying.
Mark has a question.
Well, I have an opinion about the training of artists in higher education, if I may share it. I really think that our training spaces have become overly discursive. It's all about explaining what you did and pointing to a body of references. And having a conversation like we're having today and tomorrow is really refreshing and generative, because it gets into what is the function of art, or the possible function of art. And I don't think we're asking that question enough. And so when I think about art's possibility of having a healing function, it completely changes the way I think about making things. That's really exciting.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point too, like in contrasting, as you were talking about in a therapeutic context, there's a different expectation where that clinician is doing a lot of communicative work on behalf of someone else to be there to understand. And I think that oftentimes composers, we feel like that whole framework is flipped, where the responsibility for communicating what the music is about and why it is we're doing what we're doing is on us. Mm-hmm. We're not expecting necessarily that an audience is coming like really engaged with this particular way of making music. And so I think that's also helpful to think about that as you were mentioning, like how are we analyzing the purpose and function of this music.
I think we should learn to respect the fact that different people will take different things from art and music. I know, like, some people will find the concept behind a piece really intriguing, and they like diving into that, and why did the composer do this, this, and this, and oh, this is this musical element is reflecting this extra musical thought that the composer was having. And then some people just like to listen to music, you know what I mean? And so I bounce back and forth between both of those things, and I think we need to, especially in academia and in composition academia, just respect that different people like come at music from different places and enjoy music for different reasons.
That's a great note to end on. We are exactly at 5:15. Thank you all so much for your generosity and sharing with us.